I be the witch of the wood. I am. I am that very witch. When I sleep, my spirit slips away from my body and dances naked with the devil. That's how I signed his book. This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you.
I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa.
And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is episode 17 of season 5, and we are continuing our series all about horror's final girls.
Yeah, so the last episode, when we started this series, we did kind of a deep dive into the final girl trope, and we traced it all the way back really to its origins. And we discussed the Carol Clover book, Men, Women, and Chainsaws. And we discussed a little bit about what the final girl is, what she looks like, how she acts, what sets her apart from other female characters in horror stories, at least according to Clover. We stuck pretty close to Clover's definition since that's where the phrase originated. And we also had a little discussion about some early instances of final girls. So we talked a bit about Psycho because that's what Carol Clover kind of pinpoints as the first, well, not the first slasher, but like the predecessor to the first slasher. I think she really pinpoints Halloween as being the really kind of prototype for a slasher. She also talks a bit about Alien, but she talks about the final girl. That is the girl who is able to outlast everybody. She is both the ultimate victim, but also the ultimate survivor. And some of the things that Carol Clover talked about in her book was that she has usually something that sets her apart from other female characters. Usually it's intelligence. There's often a type of, purity or innocence about her. She's often a caretaker. And she has a strength that other characters don't necessarily have, and her ability to fight back. Carol Clover, and we pointed out in the last episode that this was a bit problematic today, but she sticks pretty strictly to gender stereotypes and traditional gender roles. And so the final girl often, as Carol Clover puts it, may even be considered a little bit masculine. That is, she's not entirely feminine. Sometimes she'll even have a more masculine sounding name, or a name that is ambiguous at best as far as who we're talking about. For instance, Laurie Strode in Halloween, or Ripley in Alien going by her last name, and that idea, and that she is the perfect character to kind of go up against the killer, who, again, Carol Clover kind of pointed out as sometimes not always completely masculine. Now, these are all Carol Clover's ideas, but that's where we started with our last episode. In this episode, we thought we would look at a few more modern or contemporary instances of the final girl, because I do think she has shifted since the 70s and 80s, when, that was the time period that Carol Clover was writing about. And kind of we can talk about how she has shifted a little bit. So we started this episode with a quote from the movie The Witch. And that is I think, a good place for us to start this discussion, because The Witch gives us a really interesting kind of, I don't want to call it a twist on the final girl, but definitely a different type of final girl. Now, I'll go ahead and say that The Witch is not necessarily a slasher film. I think the final girl, that's one of the things we can talk about in this episode, but that really, the final girl has kind of bled over into other types of horror. So she's not limited to just slashers anymore. I think you can really look at it as any type of female character who, or maybe, I don't know, maybe by the end of this discussion, we might even say she doesn't have to be female, but she's kind of I think an outsider character is a better way of putting it. who does survive the horrors and the trauma to the end. And so she ends up being the ultimate survivor. So we're going to start off talking about the witch. Some of the others we might talk about, I don't know, maybe like Ready or Not, which is one of my personal favorites. Midsommar. She was discussed quite a bit in books. So we might talk about like Riley Sager's book, Final Girls. And, also how she's exploding, maybe is the right word, stereotypes for the final girl by reaching out beyond gender and racial boundaries too. And so we might talk about how some current movies are subverting the final girl trope as she exists. But well, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. So I don't know. Why don't we just jump in with this? I'm going to toss this over to Matt or Mel. I'm curious to hear some of your thoughts about how the final girl has shifted, especially as we entered into the 21st century.
Well, I'll kind of jump in there, answer your question there. I'll be honest, I know you may want to discuss The Witch. I still haven't seen that movie yet, and you can gasp in horror and shock at that. It's I promise it's on my list.
I'm clutching my pearls. I am scandalized, Matt.
It's in my list. I that's all I can say. Unfortunately, my list of movies is only slightly shorter than my books to be read pile. So I do have it fairly high up there, though. It is something I'm intending to watch. I just have not had a chance to watch it yet. So I'm going to kind of slide past that a little bit. But I think we had mentioned this kind of in planning, but I was thinking in preparation for this episode of kind of the pivot point for Final Girls. And I think we had kind of mentioned it, like I said, in planning for this, that I think if we were going to try to put a pin in where that started to shift, it would be the end of the 90s with the Scream movies, a slasher movie that's a self-aware slasher movie that uses all of those tropes of the slasher movie while at the same time deconstructing them. Like, it's a very epitome of a postmodern type of movie where it's aware of itself, but also still kind of repeating all of the tropes that it does or has. But the final girl into the 21st century, I think, does have a lot of inversions or explosions. I'm not quite sure what the right word for it would be, but there's definitely a lot of takes on it, I think, that have begun to, like you said, really expand what we can consider of the definition. And I was actually really struck by your kind of rhetorical question that you mentioned of a final girl not even necessarily being not necessarily being a girl. And I thought about that as like kind of wondering what it would take for that to be possible and not and still fit the criteria of final girl and not a typical other type of horror movie. And I don't know, I'm kind of stuck on that. I'm really not stuck in a bad way, but like that, I'm really chewing on that and thinking of how that would go about, because I can't think of any examples off the top of my head, but I really want to see one. if that makes sense.
Well, it may, I mean, I guess in order for us to get there, it may make sense to kind of talk about what happened in like the 90s and the aughts as the final girl was changing, because I think you're right in kind of pinpointing Scream as a moment when it changed, because Scream, as you said, is a self-aware movie, and well, all of them are. I recently rewatched the first two. I want to rewatch 3 and 4. I just, like you, Matt, I'm running short on time these days. But the thing that really struck me about her is, I mean, Sydney fits the final girl prototype very easily. I mean,
purposefully even.
Yeah, purposefully. Yeah. I mean, her name is Sydney. She's a brute, so that could be a feminine or masculine name. You know, again, going with Carol Clover's ideas of gender. She's a brunette. That was one thing that Carol Clover pointed out, is that often she's going to be brunette and not blonde. She is set apart from her friends in that she seems to be more studious, more intelligent, you know, quieter. She's friends with kind of the party crowd, but she seems much more subdued. And then she's like, I mean, she's very virginal, right? She makes that whole point in the first movie of, you know, would you settle for a PG-13 relationship instead of a rated R relationship? And she flashes her boobs.
I was just going to mention that.
It's a great scene. But then one of the things that's really, you know, fascinating in that movie is that she does decide to sleep with her boyfriend about halfway through that movie. And that's when things really start, you know, going crazy, because the killers in that film know the horror genre. And, you know, once she kind of gives herself over to her boyfriend in that way, then she becomes, you know, a prime target for them. But at the same time, you know, that movie, I remember seeing it in theaters, and when they had marketed it, the first Scream, Neve Campbell, now she had done, you know, Party of Five, and she had done The Craft, so she was a well-known name, but Drew Barrymore was the one that they were marketing. And it was almost as if they were building Drew Barrymore up to be the final girl of Scream. You know, she was the one who was on all the posters. And Drew Barrymore dies very quickly. I mean,
it's a phenomenal bait and switch. I still love that to this day, that they did that.
Yeah. And so even though Drew Barrymore's character doesn't fit all the typical, you know, she doesn't tick all the boxes for final girl, like, she was definitely set up to do that. And then the other movie I think that really shifted things was, oh gosh, it just flew out of my head. Cabin in the Woods.
Oh, yes. I'm glad you brought that one up, because I did have that on. I did want to mention that one as well.
Well, go ahead and mention it a little bit and talk about it, because I think that moves like the final girl almost just as much as Scream did.
Well, I think what I love so much about Cabin in the Woods, and I would say I like it better than Scream. Well, I don't know if I can say that. It's apples and oranges, because they've got such different tones to them. But it is so self-aware as well, and it is definitely playing with the horror genre. I think with Cabin in the Woods, though, what's really interesting is that the final girl still ultimately ends up choosing not to, like, she makes the choice not to be the final girl. And spoilers for a 10-year-old movie if you haven't seen it yet. But I mean, her and her friends are set up and orchestrated by these puppet masters to essentially become the stereotypes of horror movies. And even though the blonde girl, who is not originally the slutty ditzy girl, through the drugs and gas and whatever else they use to influence her, she becomes that, just as oh god, I can't think of his name, Thor, you know, Hemsworth. Chris Hemsworth.
I was supposed to say one of the Chris's.
Yes. I mean, he turns into this stereotypical jock character, and they all end up playing these roles, but they're almost being and I love that reveal that they're being orchestrated, because they're being used to appease this Cthulhu-esque old god type thing. But again, spoiler if you haven't seen it, but at the end of the movie, the girl who's picked to be the final girl chooses not to, and basically just lets the world end. And I mean, that's just kind of where it ends, with this abrupt, you know, the world ending, we can only assume. But, well, Lisa, what are your thoughts on Cabin in the Woods as far as how it shifted things further than Scream? Because well, I'm curious on that, because to me it seems very similar in that regard.
It does. I don't know. Scream was one of those movies that felt like we're allowing, to me at least, when I remember watching it, it was one of those movies where I was like, oh, okay, they're allowing, finally, quote unquote, allowing the final girl character to like be a little bit more risque, because up to that point I had always associated like final girls with Laurie Strode from Halloween, you know, who and there was always the joke, even in like later Halloween movies and like the Friday the 13th movies, like all the franchises I associated with slasher, or even like Nightmare on Elm Street, you know, I always associated it with, it's the final girl is the good girl. And I think we talked about this last time when we were talking about kind of the urban legend feel to a lot of the slashers, and how the final girl felt like kind of a stock character out of those urban legends, which, you know, urban legends really exist kind of in the way fairy tales exist, which is to teach something, you know? So you might tell people not to go take their dates and park their car out, you know, at Makeout Point because there's a man with a hook hand that's going and killing couples. And that is there to scare people away from doing things, right? That's there to essentially scare teenagers and keep them from, you know, doing things like sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Like that was kind of the point. And so the slasher was almost like an extended urban legend, because the teenagers who were supposed to get killed first were the ones who were doing the bad things. Like they were the ones who were crossing those lines. And the one who survives, she's supposed to be the quote unquote good girl, right? And that's what I find really fascinating about Scream, because I remember when I was watching it and it felt like in the theater when I watched it, it felt like, oh, this is something new. Like we're taking a stand, because it was the 90s, right? It was a time where it was just edgier and, you know, you could get away with more. And so our final girls were going to be able to get away with more. And I feel like that's the way it was, because when I think about other girls and final girls in the 90s, I immediately think of Jennifer Love Hewitt and I Know What You Did Last Summer and those movies. And she was a very similar type. Like she was still very smart and very brunette, but she was allowed to be like a little bit sexier. She wasn't the babysitter, right? She was still going out and having fun with her friends and like drinking and, you know, having a good time. So that's what felt different to me. But by the time we get like fast forward like 10 years, or I don't remember when Cabin in the Woods came out, sometime in the aughts or around there. Time is meaningless, but somewhere around the Cabin in the Woods, that shift felt different to me, because there were always sequels in slashers. Like that's another marker of the slasher genre, and that the final girl always, like, she's never really done fighting. She always has to come back. Like Sidney Prescott fights through all the movies. You know, Jennifer Love Hewitt comes back for the sequel, you know, and it follows her. And then that Cabin in the Woods felt so different because she recognizes her role as the final girl in a way that was different. But she also is like, I'm over this, and literally puts a stop to everything. Like in that ending where she's just like, the world is too far gone and I don't want to save it. That to me was, I thought, a pretty powerful moment. I mean, it was a great movie, but it was also a pretty powerful moment for the final girl, because she fights back in a way we had never seen her, and quite literally puts that cycle to an end. Like there's not going to be a sequel after the world ends. So she felt more triumphant and more of a winner than just a survivor, if that makes sense. But she also felt very world weary too. like that ending is kind of a defeatist ending in a weird way, because she's just like, no, the world is too messed up. So yeah, I don't know, but I do feel like Cabin in the Woods pushed it further.
It sounds like to me what you're describing is that it just completely explodes the definition. Like at the beginning of the episode, you were saying maybe, and I think you're right, that, Carol Clover's definition was great in the way that she used it, and there was a pattern that she was seeing. But if we continue using her precise definition and don't allow for changes, it just becomes this kind of static thing that just gets repeated over and over again. And it seems like the meta aspects of the 90s movies still had the same similar aspects of the final girl, even though she could break the rules in certain areas. It sounds like to me what you're talking about with Cabin in the Woods is just completely breaking genre. Like it's so meta. The genre itself is being used as this pattern. It's like society will be destroyed if we don't distill you all down to particular roles and make you do these certain things. And I find it fascinating that you're saying the woman is basically saying, well, if society needs me to act in this stereotypical way, I'm tired. Like, I'm tired. I'm just going to break it. It's just going to end. And I think that's a very powerful thing. And I see what you're saying about it pushing our definition, maybe even just breaking the whole definition, because you're right. Like, sequels make a perpetuation of a pattern, whereas it sounds like what you're describing in Cabin in the Woods, Lisa, is just totally destroying it. Like, we can't do this anymore. She gets to be an individual, even if society needs her to act in the stereotypical way. She's going to choose to resist, even if that means death, which is really interesting. I wonder if that's like the kind of combustion. I mean, I don't know, Lisa or Matt. I mean, do you guys see that as like the end point for what we think of as a quote unquote traditional Clover final girl, with that kind of symbolic explosion of the genre and the definition? Or am I going too far in my interpretation of what you're talking about?
Well, I can, and thank you, Lisa, for your explanation there. I do agree with what you were saying. I'll be honest, I was trying to rely on my memory, having not seen Cabin in the Woods in several years. So I think there's that. But I guess, Mel, to kind of answer your question, I definitely could mark it as like a watershed moment. I think there are still slashers being made that still have that typical final girl, but it definitely, I think, opened the door for some of the other changes, including some of the movies that Lisa mentioned at the top of the episode. So I'm actually going to kind of see if Lisa wants to jump in and maybe discuss The Witch, since she seemed pretty eager to talk about that one and how it fits in here.
Yeah, I would love to talk about it, because I think one thing that has happened after the final girl was exploded, at least as a concept, is that because she does continue to endure, there is a final girl that I don't know, I almost feel like she's enjoyed kind of a renaissance in the past, maybe even like 5 years. Certainly some of my favorite, what I would kind of consider characters I would at least pinpoint as final girls, have been rather recently. I did mention a few of them at the top of the hour. So I will say, just as a warning to Matt and to our listeners who maybe have not seen The Witch, we are going to spoil it. I do not think you really can spoil that movie, because it's a pretty straightforward movie. And honestly, even if you listen to us discuss it, it's worth a watch. And I don't think it would ruin the viewing of it, because it's one of those movies that needs to be really experienced. And there's not really a big twist in it, so there's not really a big reveal that we're trying to keep secret or anything like that. So yeah, we can talk about that, because some of the others are maybe more, that I mentioned, are more prototypical final girls. I mentioned the movie Ready or Not, which, again, I don't know if people would call that a slasher, because I guess some of the killing is done with more than just a knife. I would put it in the slasher realm. And in that one, Grace is a pretty standard final girl. really interesting. She plays a bride. So kind of that idea of what roles we put women in. There's also Happy Death Day, which came out a few years ago, which is that definitely is a slasher because it does have a killer with a knife, a masked killer with a knife, by the way. And that final girl, she's just fantastic. She's a lot of fun. And again, she takes a note from Sydney, I think, in Scream and makes it fun. She has a lot more fun than Sydney does. I think some of these other final girls don't. Midsommar, I would consider Danny a final girl, even though that's not really a slasher. And then there's The Witch. So Mel and I were actually having a conversation earlier about this movie and whether or not Thomason, the character of Thomason, played by Anya. Wait, who does she play? I am blanking.
I can't remember her last name. She's in Queen's Gambit, right?
She is, and I can see her face so clearly. And I'm sure listeners are like, Anya Taylor-Joy. they're probably like, screaming the name at the at us right now. Okay, so she plays Thomason in this. And again, this is not a traditional slasher. So I think that's one of the things that once the final girl trope was exploded, the final girl was able to go out into other forms of the horror genre. And I think this is a good example. But just to kind of set the scene, Thomason is a character. So when we first meet her, she is leaving a town, like a settlement, with her family. They've basically been kicked out and asked to leave. We don't fully know what all happened, except that her father got into some sort of argument with some of the men in town and was asked to leave. And so they have to pack up. This takes place in, I don't know if do they give the year in the 1600s, around there?
1630s.
Okay, that sounds right. It was a long time ago. And yeah, so she is leaving with her family, and you kind of have this like fairy tale feel to it, where it's like entering the woods, going out into the wilderness. This is why I think, by the way, she kind of fits our new definition, because it does have that kind of urban legend fairy tale feel about it. But they have to set up a new home, and so they're very isolated. Her father, we learn, is very religious, maybe even more so than the people of the town. So very given to what I would consider like religious hysteria, but he's just very stern and very strict. And obviously the whole family is very overwhelmed, having to fend for themselves out in the woods. And, they're scared because they don't know if they are realistically going to make it through the winter, not having other people to rely on, and having to, basically provide everything they need for themselves. So mom and dad are very preoccupied with setting up their new home and making sure that their family has what they need. And Thomason is, as the oldest child, has to kind of take the caretaker role of her younger siblings. And if I'm remembering right, it's been a while, I want to say she's got a younger brother, a younger sister, and then there's a baby. And the baby becomes a particular problem, as early in the movie, the baby disappears. So she is watching the baby, and it's kind of one of those, the baby was there 1 minute and the baby's not there. And obviously everybody blames her because she was supposed to be watching the child. And things just go downhill from there, because very quickly, I want to say her mom starts it. Mel, you might have to correct me on this, because this is where it gets fuzzy, but her mom accuses her of being a witch. Like it's basically one of these kind of hysterical, and the two younger siblings kind of jump in on it, saying that they saw her speak to the devil through one of their goats. A very particularly creepy goat, by the way.
Well, it takes a little bit longer than that, but you're right. It is the mom who kind of goes hysterical first and accuses her. But like, it has a slow burn to it.
It
There's
is
a little bit more
it
than
is,
that.
yeah.
She kind of damns herself because to make the twins leave her alone, because the twins are the ones who talk to Black Phillip all the time.
Yes.
And Thomason is afraid that she thinks they're being silly, but she's also afraid that maybe something's going on, but she doesn't know what to do about it. And she says she's a witch to get the twins to leave her alone, and they do on that. But yeah, the witch stuff, I don't think, if I remember, I just watched this really recently, but I think the witch accusation happens after the brother who goes into the woods and disappears for a while and comes back all screwed up, like in a hysteria of his own. That's when the witch accusation happens, because the twins jump onto it too because of what she said to them joking.
Right.
But before that, her mom hates her because her mom thinks she lost the kid, which she didn't. Her father says it was probably a wolf or an animal. And the mom thinks she stole the silver cup when actually the father took it. And he doesn't tell the mom until like halfway through the movie. So the mom is pissed off at her and wants to put her in a house with a servant, partially to save money and food for them. But yeah, there's dissension there, but it's not until that kid comes back messed up from his encounter with the witch in the woods that she goes all witch accusation. And then the twins start acting like they're bewitched.
Right.
Because they don't want to be accused. It turns into like a Puritan hysteria fest, basically.
It is. I mean, there are multiple layers. Like I said, this is not a slasher film. There are multiple layers of horror at work. I mean, obviously, first, there's the horror of the wilderness, which, we've talked about, like isolation horror and the things that could be in the woods. And that definitely hits on some sort of primal terror that they're building on. There's the like mystery / terror / horror of losing the baby, because just the fact that they could so casually say, well, an animal got the baby is terrifying in and of itself. That just, chills me. And again, it's that also kind of goes hand in hand with the terror of the wilderness, the thing that separate, when you take civilization away, like how quickly the wilderness can become dangerous for us. And then you add on top of this like family strife. There's definitely contention with her and her mother. And then, like you said, the religious hysteria of it. It brings up all of the terrifying accounts of like the Salem witch trials and all of that. It's terrifying. But at the center, you have this character of Thomason. And she's the one I really want to talk about, because if we're going to kind of pinpoint her as a new type of final girl, I think it's worthwhile exploring kind of how she weathers the terrors, because that's, I think, the big point of the new final girl, before we just get rid of everything that Carol Clover like put on her, is that she has to be a survivor, right? And I think she has to explode, maybe that's the right word, out of a certain role that society wants to put her in. So yeah, let's talk about Thomason a little bit, because as a character, she's really interesting. First of all, Mel, you mentioned to me that she fits a few of Clover's rules, kind of quote unquote rules. I mean, Thomason in and of itself is kind of an ambiguous name when you're looking at it. Even though, yes, I know the IN on the end makes it feminine, but
she's obsessed with purity. She wants to be a good person. She actually wants to be good, even though her mom thinks she's rebellious.
Yes. Yeah. Her mom paints her to be a really terrible child, when in reality, all she wants to do is be that kind of good girl. And she is obsessed with purity. That kind of, in a weird way, becomes her downfall, because does it say in the movie how old she is?
No, I mean, I'm guessing between I'm guessing like between 13 and 16 because she could become a servant girl, right? So she's
Right.
probably what, like 13, 14?
I would put her around there, early teens.
Yeah.
But she's obviously at that point where she's like exiting childhood, entering womanhood. And there's all sorts of, I mean, we're in a Puritan society that's obsessed with like purity. She's certainly obsessed with purity, Thomason is. But she's developing into a woman. And that becomes, I think, a problem with her and her mother in particular, with her mother saying she's, rebellious, or I forget some of the things her mother accuses her of before she accuses her of being a witch. But you would just think she was just out there raising hell when all she's doing is trying to like keep her brothers and sisters safe. I don't know. She's a really interesting, I think, final girl character. What else did we talk about surrounding her?
Well, I mean, you're right. That's not necessarily a slasher, but it had the feel of one because, I mean, you can view the movie in a couple different ways, but like if you look at it like there is an evil presence that's tormenting them, she is a survivor of that, and her family's picked off one by one. Now the trick with that is they succumb to their fear and divide against each other rather than standing up against it. But she survives. So like the baby is, we see a woman killing the baby and using it for flying ointment that witches supposedly did. So there's the implication that that's what's going on. There's the implication that maybe the boy, was it Caleb, when he gets lost in the woods and comes back, has encountered somebody. Of course, he was having issues with the sexual repression himself, so his hysteria has a weird kind of sexual turn to it. But so he's been kind of picked off in a weird way. And then when Thomason is having all those when all the family's having like cracktastic visions that final night before everything just goes to hell, after they've all accused each other of being witches, and the father's just like, I don't even know what's going on. The twins are just like taken away by some woman that they see who has a knife, and we assume that they've been killed. And Thomason wakes up and her father comes out and she sees the goat kill her father and her father's dead. And then her mom just like loses it and is like, you're the reason all this has happened, and goes all like Shirley Jackson townspeople on her. And she uses a knife, the phallic object, to kill her mom. And then she's the only one left who may starve, die of exposure, whatever, because she can't go back to the town because they're going to accuse her of being a witch, even though they don't know what's going on. Like that's going to be the first thing they think when she comes back alone, her family's dead. But I thought that also had a slasher feel to it because something's happening, whether they're succumbing to hysteria or there's something evil or both. She survives, whereas they all either get so like lose touch with reality that they can't survive, or are getting kidnapped or something. So I thought that even though it's slightly different, that too, like her purity, her intelligence, her wanting to do the right thing. Oh, and she also stands up for her father, which I thought was interesting. She messes with society's expectations for her as a woman because her father says, well, which is not Puritan, so I guess that's why he got thrown out. But he's like, just confess that you were tempted to become a witch and everything will be okay, which that's not going to happen. And if the villagers find out, they're going to do something bad to her. But she's just like, I'm not. And then she tells him, you can't take care of us. This is all your fault. What she says, you're a liar. You're a hypocrite. You threw me under the bus with my mom. You don't believe me that I'm not a witch. You won't help me. And so he gets really pissed. He gets more pissed off that she's rebelling against him and speaking her mind to him, a woman to the head of the family, and questioning his ability to be the head of the family, than he was when he thought she might be a witch. Which I thought was interesting. There's a lot of issues with her kind of either trying to fit into patriarchal society or being in conflict with it. And that also kind of reminded me of the final girl a little bit. So it's interesting to me that, yeah, I don't think we need to completely jettison Clover, but there are parts that are still there, but it's going in like a different direction, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Or it's being used in a slightly different way.
It does. Well, and I think for all the frustrating things reading Carol Clover's book now, in 2021, that was kind of one of the points she made with the final girl, is that the final girl subverts those gender roles. And I think that's what Clover was getting at when she says, like, oh, the final girl is like not fully what we would consider feminine. Like, she doesn't fit nicely into that feminine role. And that's what makes her a good counterpoint for the killer in the end, because the killer doesn't fit in the traditional masculine role either. And that's what's kind of like, they're both essentially outsiders in that way. And I think that when you take something like The Witch and you look at Thomason, I think you're absolutely right, because she has like taken on and internalized what she is supposed to be as a woman in society, but she's also pushing back against that. And that's what makes her kind of a standout final girl. Like, she's not rebellious like her mother thought she was, but she knows enough to like stand up for herself when she has to stand up for herself. And that was something, especially for the 1630s, was not something that was ever supposed to be tolerated, which is really kind of fascinating, because if you take that movie at its face value, in that, I guess the real kind of quote unquote killer of that movie would be the devil, right? I guess. Or the Witch of the Woods. I'm struggling to figure out, but it's some sort of evil, like nebulous evil.
Yeah, that was the impression I got. Is this the devil, or it's like the devil working through the witch, I guess, was what we're supposed to think.
Yeah. But
which Thomason does a Carol Clover thing at the end, and that because Carol Clover says the final girl always has the possibility of teetering over the edge into the killer's position. And
right.
Thomason, she has nothing left, so she has to join. She goes and says to the goat, "Hey, Black Phillip, the twins said you were talking to them and saying evil things. I saw you kill my dad. Like, just say something." Like, she's basically like, just say something. So I know I'm not insane after all this, you know? And he does. And it's the devil. And he offers her a bunch of stuff. And she signs a book. Now, again, this could be her break with reality because of the horrible situation. I mean, I can't even imagine what a terrible situation she's in. But if you read it as if her family has been being driven insane and picked off gradually one by something in the woods, then she is empowered in some ways, because I do think there's this idea of maybe like female empowerment at the end when she joins Community Witches, but we don't know that they're going to take her in for sure. And she may be joining the people who were tormenting her family. So it's like either she's becoming maybe the victimizer, or she's still a victim. But I mean, she's still making unorthodox decisions, you know. I mean, she's making decisions based on her survival, I guess is what I mean. But it puts her in an awkward position of going over the edge into what Clover said the final girl could do, which is kind of go to the dark side.
And I mean, I know we're starting to run towards the end of the episode, but I do want to point out that when everything you're talking about, absolutely, I think solidifies, in my mind at least, that Thomason is kind of what we would consider the new final girl, or like the final girl today. But I see a lot, as you were talking about that, I see a lot of similarities between her and Carrie. Just because, you know, again, you have an outsider, you have somebody who is obsessed with it. I mean, Carrie was very obsessed with purity, especially in the beginning, so much so that she absolutely freaks out when she gets her first period. Of course, that has a lot to do with her mother, but she has the isolation, the religious hysteria, you know, the really ultra conservative religious upbringing that is, you know, adding to things. And Carrie, in that case, I mean, Thomason is pushed to she's, I think, just defending herself. And then she, like you said, kind of, that's a claiming, you could see the end as like a claiming of her power, but really it's because she has been left no other option. After everything that has happened. I mean, she has no other option. Carrie is like a really interesting thing in that, I don't know, like she pushes back against her mother in a spectacular fashion, but she also then retaliates, and she does move into that killer role. Like she does teeter over into that. And I pulled out Carol Clover's book again to see, because I remember she talked a little bit about Carrie, but she points it out. She points, Carol Clover, being the she, points out that Carrie says, it's not Satan's power, it's me. When I concentrate, I can move things. So she recognizes in herself the power that she has, and that is how, like, the final girl kind of turns into the female story. And I feel like the witch also does that, because even though we're not fully comfortable, I think the ending is still, it's an ambiguous ending, and it's an uncomfortable ending for a lot of people. And I know there were a lot of people who didn't like the ending of The Witch, but I feel like she's claiming that power that was denied her, kind of in the same way Carrie was. So I don't know. I find that really, really kind of fascinating. Talking about her in that sort of way. But yeah, I like pinpointing Thomason from The Witch as kind of being today's example of a final girl. There's a lot of final girls with unclear endings. I mean, Dani certainly fits that with Midsummer, because even though she survives, and she definitely has a moment of reclaiming power, but it again, it's very uncomfortable, and it's questionable of whether or not she is actually kind of pushed over that edge of where final girl and killer kind of meet. You know, some of the other ones, yeah, I don't know. That's really kind of fascinating. Yeah, I think, I don't know, there's a lot more I want to say about the final girl. But I don't want this to run like a 2-hour long episode. So I think that would be a good place for us to kind of put a pin in this discussion. We are going to continue our discussion of the final girl. A few things I would like to kind of say. I know I mentioned a few other final girls that like existed, for instance, like Ready or Not, or Happy Death Day, or even the book Final Girls. I think all those kind of fit the more traditional idea of the final girl. So after our discussion of The Witch, I'm not as interested, honestly, in talking about them. I will say that, kind of to tease some things that we might talk about in the future, and something that I know Matt had he was already thinking about. So Matt, I'm mainly saying this to like plant the seed in your head. One of the things that people have talked about with the final girl and how she's evolving is that, you know, can she move past this idea of being like the typical middle class white brunette girl? And what does it mean when she looks a little bit different from that? So there are some great resources that you can look at, like our listeners, if you'd like to, that look at Black final girls. So kind of a horror genre that moves beyond it. I know Graveyard Shift Sisters is a website that has a really good discussion on that. So that would be worth looking. The documentary that's on Shudder right now called Horror Noir has a good look at it. But I have found some really interesting articles talking about how Jordan Peele is subverting the final girl trope completely in Get Out. Mainly how, in that case, the final girl, the one who we would think of who fits the kind of middle-class white brunette final girl, is the character of Rose. And she plays that, you know, as kind of the, oh, I'm sweet, I'm innocent, and I'm a caretaker. Of course, she's not. She's definitely part of the killers. So she's very manipulative in that way. And she knows how to manipulate that. She knows how to manipulate what she is and how people perceive her. And in a really strange sort of way, her boyfriend that she lures to the house ends up being, I mean, he's the survivor of the film. So in a way, he kind of takes on that role of final girl. Like I said, there are articles circulating around about there that are probably going to be so much more intelligent than anything I could talk about. But, you know, it's interesting to think about, especially I think through the lens of a film like Get Out, what happens when a final girl knows, or I would say a character knows that she can play the part of a final girl, and how she can use that to be manipulative and harmful. And then who actually is the final girl. So I don't know. There's some really interesting things that people are doing with this trope. We're just going to have to finish this discussion in more episodes because there's too much to cover. But yeah, I don't know. I'm really enjoying seeing how this character and this trope is developing. As always, listeners, if you have an idea or maybe a final girl or a film that we haven't discussed yet and you want us to discuss it in a future episode, reach out to us. We're at No Fear Cast on Twitter and Instagram. We also have a Facebook page circulating around there. Our email is nofearcast@gmail.com. If you love what we're doing, consider supporting us on Patreon. You get access to exclusive content when you do that. In fact, we had a really fun discussion, continuing our discussion of Final Girls. We looked at Black Christmas on the last one for our Patreon supporters, and that was a lot of fun to kind of do a deep dive into that. But of course, we understand that not everybody has the funds to support us right now. But what you can do is rate and review us. It is entirely free for you, but it does help other listeners find us. And of course, there's always just good old-fashioned word of mouth. We very much appreciate that. Our theme music is by Nicholas Gasparini. Thanks for listening. We will be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.